Today we're going to work on this coat for our dolls using McCall's M7301. This pattern has 4 pieces. This one is for the collar, piece number 10, and you cut 2 of these. This one, piece number 8, is for the pockets on the front of the coat. You can see them here. Maybe they're not too noticeable, but the pockets on the front, you will cut 2 of those. And then we have a lining piece, which we cut 2 of, and then we have the main fabric piece, which we cut 2 as well. The fabrics that I'm using are a black twill and a very thin black cotton. It's like a cotton batiste fabric, and it's very thin and light. Let's get started. We're going to begin with our pocket pieces. So I'm going to move all of these out of the way, and I've started warming up my iron. These seam allowance are 1/4 of an inch. The best way to prepare to press them over and to make it easier, because it's such a small seam allowance, is to baste at the 1/4 of an inch seam line. Baste it with your longest stitch, and then use that basting stitch as a guide to press it over. My needle, from where it will land in the middle of my presser foot to the edge, is 1/4 of an inch. I've measured it and I have it set. So I'm just going to baste this. And it may be a little hard to see. Oh, well, you can see it right there. There's my thread. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that basting thread as a guide to press it over. That will make your life so much easier. Do that for both of the pockets on both sides of the seams. Both of my side seams are pressed down. So now we're going to go back to the pattern piece. And what we want to do here is press down the hem allowance. The hem allowance here is almost 3/4 of an inch. So what I'm going to do is just simply mark where I'm going to begin basting my hem. And I'm just going to baste across and then use that as a guide to press the hem down. Basting that down before you press it down also helps to secure the seam allowance on the back and makes it easier to work with. So now I'm going to put my pattern piece over it just to make sure I've got it aligned correctly, and I do. So I'm going to go ahead and press that. Our hems are sewn down, and we're going to work now on sewing this onto the front of our coat. Before we begin placing our pockets onto our coat, you're going to sew 1/8 of an inch right at the top of where we folded over for the hem. So our front coat piece, well, it's actually the front and the back, because as you can see, the way it's cut, this is the front, this is the sleeve. We don't have separate sleeve pieces for this pattern. And this is going to be the back. This is marked center back, and this is marked center front. And you also have fold lines here for where we're going to fold and so forth. So right now we're going to place our pockets on the front pieces. So what we do, and what we want to make sure, is that we have both of our pieces facing each other with the sleeves out. This way you know you're getting the placement of the pockets correctly. So what I did on the pattern piece was I just cut a couple of slits right over the placing line so that I can place my pattern correctly. And this one I had to flip over to make the chalk marking here. So what we'll do is we will take our pockets, put them right over the placement lines, and that's where we are going to sew our pockets. I've pinned my pocket piece right over the placement lines, and we are going to sew very close to the edge, about 1/8 of an inch. We're going to go up and stop, and then we're going to do the same thing on the other side. And now this edge that we have even with our bottom front, we are going to simply baste it. When you're done, you should be able to put your finger inside of the pocket, and this part is going to be basted and hemmed later, so you don't have to worry about stitching that part down. So for now, you should be able to put your finger through that one as well. I'm going to do my next pocket, and then we'll work on the next step of our pattern. It may be a little difficult to see, but I have both of my pockets sewn in. You see my pockets are open here at the top, and the bottom side is basted, and this is a regular stitch. Now what we're going to do, we're ready for our next step, and we are going to put one piece of our coat on top of the other, and we're gonna sew our back seam down. Now our back seam, make sure you have this right when you're doing it. Our back seam does not have the front pockets, and it does have 3 notches here. So you're just going to sew that down at 1/4 of an inch. We've sewn down our center back. So this is what the pattern now looks like. That's our center back here with our seam. And when you look at it this way, opened up, and you fold it down, you're going to see that your pockets are going to be right on the front. Here are your sleeves, and here's your neck edge, which is what we're going to work with next, because we are going to now stay stitch around the neckline. It's a little odd shaped. So you're going to use a regular stitch and just go around the neckline at 1/4 of an inch, or just inside of 1/4 of an inch. Doesn't have to be exactly 1/4 of an inch. Now see how my seam here is pulling apart? So I'm going to put this back under my sewing machine, and I'm going to back stitch here because I don't like when that happens. So I'm just going to back stitch a little bit over here before I stay stitch. This part isn't in the instructions, but I think it would help. I'm going to press open my center back seam before I stay stitch the neckline. What you're looking at here is one of the sleeve pieces. It's one of the shorter sides. So before we continue sewing our coat, what I want to do is I want to hem up the sleeve about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to baste at 1/4 of an inch and then press up and then sew very close to the raw edge to hem my sleeve. Do that on both sides. I've hemmed my sleeves on both sides of the coat, and now we're going to sew the sleeves and the side seams together. So if you have your coat laying out like this, here are my pockets on the other side. We're just going to simply match up the side seams and the sleeves, and then sew it at 1/4 of an inch. And you're going to do that on both sides. Now our coat looks like this, now that we have the side seams and the sleeves sewn. What we're going to do, right at this edge here, we're going to cut in a slit that goes to the stitch line or very close to it, not through it. That is going to give our dolls space to move their arms. Just like that. Just be very careful not to go through your stitch line. All right, now you can flip it inside out, and we are going to put in our collars next. And you can press the side seams open. Now we're going to sew our collar piece. So we have 2 pieces here, and you're going to match up the raw edges, and you're going to sew from one end 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Mark your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here, pivot, sew to the other end, and then pivot back down. I suggest that you mark your corners where you're going to pivot to make it a little bit easier for you. So for instance, you can mark here, that's 1/4 of an inch mark, and then so my pivoting point is going to be right there at that spot. You can do that on both ends to make it easier. Now that we've sewn our collar piece together, you're going to trim the edge over here. Do not cut through that stitch you just made. This is going to prevent it from being so bulky when we turn it around. And if you like, you can also trim your seams. That's optional. I'm just going to trim it a little bit. And if you saw the video, the last section, I also backstitched on the ends here, because when you turn it around, sometimes those stitches come a little loose. So I backstitched there. Before we sew our collar piece on, we're going to fold back this front piece here. I'm working on the right side of my fabric. The pockets are right in front of me. So this piece here, where it says fold line, you're going to press that back. And it's 3/4 of an inch. You can also see I've marked it here. So we'll just fold that back and press it, and you'll do that on both sides. Now we'll mark our collar on the coat for where we're going to stitch our collar piece. So on the pattern piece here, you have the fold line, then you have this line with the little X's, which is the center front, and then you have this little circle. This little circle is just beyond 1/4 of an inch from the fold line. So I've marked it on my front pattern piece and on the second one as well. The other side as well is what I meant. So going back to our collar pieces, if you've turned it inside out, and make sure you push out your seam allowance here so that you get a nice pointy edge at this point here. Press your collar piece and then baste the raw edge. Once you've basted it, you're going to come back and put it here and pin it. Here I have the collar pinned to my coat. I did have to clip some of the seam allowance on the coat to help fit the collar, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to baste it, because I can see from here that when I sew it, I might get some of those little pinches in the fabric. So I'm going to baste it, and then what I'm going to go back and do is check where there's a little pinch and take that piece out with my seam ripper. And if I have to do that, I'll show you what I'm doing, because I try to get it as smooth as possible on the right side of the fabric. And it's going to be a little hard to do this because, as you can see here, this neck portion is such a tight little curve that this is the part we have to clip into. So this part might be a little bit challenging, but just take your time with it. Okay, so I basted it on, and you can see what I was doing. I was lifting the presser foot and smoothing out the fabric on the coat side to try and prevent any of those little puckers. So let's see how it came out when we look at underneath the collar. And I think it came out pretty good. There's no puckers. Okay, so now I'm going to go back on the coat side again, and I'm going to sew my regular stitch, and this is at 1/4 of an inch. And as I work my way through sewing this, I'm just going to continue to flatten out the fabric where I don't want any puckers under that seam. So I'm setting my stitch back to 2.5, and I'll start to sew. Now we have our collar basted and stitched to our front part of the coat. So let's put this aside for now, And we're going to work on the lining. And what we're going to do with the lining first is we're going to sew our center back seam. And that's the side with the 3 little notches. After we stitch our center back seam, we're going to press it open, and then we will stay stitch the neckline here at 1/4 inch. The next steps are pretty much going to follow what we did for our coat. So what we will do in the next few steps is we're going to hem our sleeves about 1/4 inch in, and then once you're done with that, you're going to keep it right sides together, and you're going to sew your side seam and your sleeve together. So first, we'll sew up our little hems on the sleeve, and then we'll sew the sides. All right, now we should have our side seams and our sleeves sewn together on our lining part of the coat. I'm just trimming all my threads. And where I stay stitched the neckline, clean that up. I clean these up as I go along sewing because sometimes they get stuck under the feed dogs in the machine, so I try to prevent that as much as possible. All right, so now it's on its right side, and this is my lining. So our next step with the lining and our coat right sides together, we're going to pin the opening front edges. So this edge here and this edge here. So what you're looking at, and it's probably hard to see from this angle, this is the back side of my front part of the coat, my main coat fabric. The front side with the pocket is facing the front side of the lining. So if I flip this around, you see the seam of my lining. Okay, so right sides together. And we're going to match up our front facings and pin that together. Before I start sewing, I just wanted to show you where I have it pinned, and this is just the front edge of the coat on both sides. So I'm going to sew this at 1/4 inch, and this will just sew the lining and the front part of the coat at the front edges together. And again, we're going right sides together on this part. Now that we have our front edges of the coat sewn together, we are going to press the seam allowance towards the lining. So this piece here is my outside fabric, This is my lining. And what I'm going to do is just take that seam allowance and press it towards the lining fabric. And I'll do that on both sides. Okay. Now, at the collar's edge, we're going to pin the collar's edge together. Now we're going to work on our collar piece. We have the edges sewn and pressed. So right now what we're looking at is my lining piece, and I did push out the sleeves on this end. And what I'm doing here, this is remember when we pressed the front back? So we're going to press that back with the lining. And this collar piece that you see here with the front piece pressed back, we're going to pin it, and then we're going to stitch it 1/4 of an inch. As you're pinning this, you may notice that there's some resistance on the lining side, squaring up to the front side of the collar nicely. Make sure that you clip your inside of that stay stitching. Don't cut across that stay stitching line, and it should fit nicely. I've got it pinned, and now I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch around that collar. And I've got my front fabric, the fabric that's going to be on the outside, folded in. So we're going to sew that for now, and then after that we'll sew a piece of the bottom edge together, leaving some open so we can flip it inside out. So the way I pinned my lower edge was by matching the seam allowance from the lining to the seam allowance on my main fabric. I did that for the center back, the sides, and when I did that for the front edge part, it's hard to see here, but this was my fold line that we pressed over earlier in the video. It automatically aligns with the way you need to sew it. Okay, so I have this portion pinned. What I'm gonna do, and you'll see in the video in the next portion, I'm gonna sew from this end to here. I'm gonna backstitch here and then skip this part, start sewing around here again, backstitch and finish. I'm gonna do that at 1/4 of an edge. I'm going to leave this part open so I can flip it over. Now to flip it, I will cut the threads where I didn't sew that section and then trim it down. Okay, and now we're gonna turn it over. So now when you turn it over, your pockets should be on the outside now. And you're going to have to poke out some of the little corners from where we folded that front edge earlier in the video. So I will need to get my tool to push that out. And you want to push your lining sleeves into your coat sleeves. And push your sleeves out. Okay, now the lining sleeve, I'm going to push it out to go inside of my main fabric sleeve. So I went ahead and turned everything inside out, and I had turned it back in again, inside out with the sleeve lining inside the coat, and I put in a few stitches with a hand needle. So I took care of that. This part here where we flipped over the fabric, I pressed it, and I'm gonna have to hem it by hand. So I'm gonna work on that as well. Here are my pockets. So we can put a couple little buttons there. Press the front edge again, put some buttons there. And for the collar, we can stitch very close to the edge and pivot it around and then press it down this way. Why don't we give it a try on the doll and see how it looks? I went ahead and put in the buttons. I stitched around the collar. I closed up the hem at the bottom, and it does look a little big, but that is the style of the coat if you look at the front of the pattern. If we look at the front of the pattern, we can see it is made to fit wide, very wide, especially at the bottom here. And it does. I'll bring her closer. So it does fit wide, but I think if you would want to take it in, you can add like a pleat at the back and kind of tack that down, and that would bring it in a little closer to the body and just give it that A shape. But I think it's pretty cute. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.